today I'd like to talk to you about schools of chess, not formal schools, not only where you can go to a physical place, but what sort of fashions and styles and key texts and key teachers were there around in chess history. A potted history, a short one, rather a cartoon one, but let me have a go. There were great players before this chap called El Greco. His name was Gioacchino Greco. I think he had a different surname than that. El Greco means the Greek, so of course he was Italian, but Italians in the 1600s who came from Calabria, where we get Calabrese, were known as Greeks, and so he was known as Giacomo the Greek. And he wrote not a book but manuscripts and copied them out for various toffs around Europe while he was beating up their star players. And these manuscripts were, the best, and really shook up how our ideas of how to play chess. That way was with fast development, grab the centre and attack if you can, and don't be afraid to sacrifice. And that's the El Greco style, and that became the style of the Italians. I mean, I think modern Italy didn't really exist then, but you might call it the Italian school. And it was taken up in the 1700s by players from Modena, the Modenese school, and they had players with names like Del Rio, Ponziani, Lolli, Palerio, and some other cats. Ponziani is the only name that most people know, mostly because of Eric Rosen popularising the Ponziani opening, which has been a very rather an obscure sideline for a lot of my chess life. And they embraced the El Greco style. They played for fast development, for attack, for initiative, and for sacrifice. And they weren't afraid to sacrifice if they could. In the 1800s, we still had this style of chess based around fast development, seizing the centre and attacking. That was and it was now called the Romantic school. I suppose what was the Romantics? Why did it make it romantic? I think they weren't afraid to make a speculative sacrifice. I mean, a lot of the sacrifices that you see in El Greco are pretty well certs. They break open a king's position that is very weak or very exposed, with a large lead in development. And not too many of them are touch and go, whereas the Romantics were more likely to risk, and in their games you can see extraordinary risk and extraordinary ideas. I mean, it's a caricature to say that that's all that they did, as we'll see later, but they really were dashing, lots of play with a lot of vim and vigour and vitality and verve and lots of other words beginning with V. So Anderson, possibly the nicest chap ever to be a world champion up until Anand, and really a great player, considered to be the strongest player after 1851 when he won the first international chess championship, eclipsed by Paul Morphy in the late 1850s, who came over to Europe to beat everybody up, and particularly Staunton, who never got around to playing him. Joseph Henry Blackburn, the Black Death, from England, and Wilhelm Steinitz from Austria. And when Steinitz beat Anderson in a match in 1866, some people count Steinitz as being the best player in the world from then, and certainly a dominant figure who turned to journalism and writing, and was an interesting chap. So to start off with, when he played Anderson, he played in the Romantic style. He played gambits and gioco piano, from the Italian game, and quite the dashing player. They used to call him the Austrian Morphy. And but something happened after that, which caused the development of the classical school. A chap called Louis Poulsen, European player, started to practice a sort of more defensive style of chess, thinking that you can defend against these dashing attacks, and they don't all work, and you can't just attack me because you want to. And he was successful with this, and became, one of the strongest in the world. And Steinitz began to think, well, what is it that makes the difference between a successful attack and an unsuccessful attack, or attack that should be successful or one that should be unsuccessful? And came to the view that if you attack without an advantage, your attack should fail. If you have an advantage, you must attack, or your advantage will fail or disappear. And if you don't have an advantage, what should you do? Well, he said, well, you should try and strive for some other form of advantage, not by direct attack, but by accumulating little advantages. A square here, a weakness there, the two bishops maybe, and put all these advantages in your pocket. When you've got enough, you might be able to cash them in for an attack, or actually it may be by the time you've accumulated enough advantages, your opponent's position will just collapse without you needing to do much more. So that was the later Steinitz, and so he transformed himself from a romantic player to a classical player, and he wrote and argued forcefully for this. And so when he played and won in the great tournament in Vienna in 1873, he was a different player, and I'll show you some games in a while that illustrate these styles. Blaska, who beat Steinitz, was very much in the Steinitz school and played great tribute to him. More of a practical player than Steinitz. Steinitz did get a bit dogmatic about trying to prove some of his theories right, and would defend really hopeless positions, trying to hang on to a pawn, for example. He believed that you could hang on, take a pawn and hang on to it, and sometimes took crazy risks to do so. And then the great German, another great writer and teacher, Tarrasch, who again rather in the Steinitz school, although played in a rather different style. He was rather fonder of a more active style of play. But that was the classical school, and that was dominant for a long while. And you can see the shift in the openings. I've written about this elsewhere, where you can see in the World Championship matches there's a move across the board from the King's Gambit to the Gioco Piano, and then Lasker was a great proponent of the Ruy Lopez, and then actually also to the Queen's Gambit, practised by Steinitz in Vienna in 73, often by Tarrasch. And it became, the weight of the argument shifted across the chessboard, and so by the time Alekhine and Capablanca were contesting the World Championship in 1927, it was all Queen's Gambits. I mean, I think 22 games were played out of some number, not much more than 22. And it was all Queen's Gambits, and it could get a bit dry. So this seeking for positional advantages of squares and files and so on, it did get a bit dry. But that was the style of the time. But before 27, there had already been a reaction against this rather dry classicism, and the hypermoderns. Teichmann said there is no such thing as the hypermodern school of chess, and it was founded by Nimzowitsch. And so other names that you'd associate with it: Raya, Breyer, Grunfeld, Tartakova, and there are probably lots of other people who would be offended to know that I'd left them out. But theirs was a slightly different take on things, particularly the opening. Didn't contest the idea that the centre was important, but didn't think the centre needed to be seized and occupied, that actually you could hold back a little while in the centre and see what your opponent did there and maybe organise yourself differently. So rather than d4, d5 as an opening way, we could play d4 and then something else as black, knight f6 with the Nimzowitsch defence, or the King's Indian defence, or the Old Indian, or the Grunfeld defence, founded indeed coincidentally by Grunfeld. And these were approaches to the opening which said, yeah, centre's important, but we don't need to occupy it, we can control it, we develop our pieces quickly, but to influence the centre rather than occupy it. And that's so that new theory of the opening, and was very influential, and had actually come into being before this very classical 1927 match. Following the hypermoderns, I'm not quite sure what the key tenets of the Soviet school might have been, of which I mean that was the coming school. Botvinnik tied for first in the Nottingham tournament in 1936 and said, "Here we are." And post-war, he was the dominant figure, and in fact, up to 1963, he was still champion, although he'd dropped the championship a couple of times in between. And I suppose if you had to say what they were doing, it would be to say, we'll try and play, and this is also a motto of the hypermoderns, not according to general principles, but according to the principles or the ideas inherent in a particular position. And that particularity is what drove a lot of Soviet stuff. And also to say, yes, I might have a weak pawn on d6, for example, in the lines of the Sicilian or the King's Indian that they practice. We might have a weak pawn on d6, but what's going on the other 63 squares? Do I have enough dynamism? Do I have enough energy? Do I have enough ideas to make a nuisance, to be active, to even have and definitely have chances for a win? An unbalanced style of playing that took not a view about the particular weakness of a pawn here or there, but tried to get a feel for what's going on across the whole position. And they played in a very much more dynamic style, as Coles described in his book Dynamic Chess. Very much more dynamic, very much more unbalanced, very much playing for a win. And so some of the prophecies of doom in the classical era that said chess was getting played out and boring, really it got turned upside down in the Soviet era. And I don't know that there's many principles that have emerged since in chess thinking in the last 70 odd years that would be different. We've changed our mind about particular positions, but that idea of the Soviet school is definitely still the dominant way of thinking. So that's the story. That's the through line, as you might say, of the development of chess thought. And it's a cartoon, and it leaves out some stuff. And particularly, it leaves out another through line, but a different through line, which is Philidor and the English school. Philidor lived in the 1700s. After Greco, but before the Modenese, and wrote a book called Analysis of the Game of Chess, in which he wrote a long sentence in French, which was shortened and translated into English as Pawns of the Soul of Chess. Philidor did try and seize the centre, but not especially with pieces. He was interested in getting a space gaining, a flexible pawn structure or a pawn position in the opening, and then backfilling with pieces after that. So get the skeleton, get the framework up, get your scaffolding up first of pawns, and then think about where you want your pieces. And he would use pawns and pawn advances in his analyses to show how things worked. And that more positional, more strategic, slower way of playing was a great influence on the English school of chess. Howard Staunton, Elijah Williams, Marmaduke Whipple, and Staunton beat a cat called Saint-Amand in a match in 1843, where he played the English opening for the first time. After which, Staunton's use of it led to the name. So it wasn't a hypermodern invention as much as an English one. And these guys did play in a positional style, and they would play the English opening, not just that, but also would play the fianchetto, a slow development of the bishop towards the side, and again try and influence the centre and occupy it later. Things that you might associate with a hypermodern movement. And in fact, this cartoon of this is how you play chess at this time, there are so many contradictions in that. I mean, for example, this idea that it was the Soviets that would put up with a weakness for the sake of activity. I mean, that was Tarrasch's defence to the Queen's Gambit all over. And Tarrasch is often derided as somebody who was rather dogmatic and inflexible. I mean, that perhaps describes his personality, but not especially his chess. And he would say, well, if you're frightened of an isolated queen's pawn, give up chess. You get plenty of space and activity for it. Let's go. Anyhow, so that's the sweep of chess history at its schools. And what I'll do now is just whiz through some games that illustrate, I hope, each of these schools and the way that they played. Hope you got something out of that. See you soon.